Ethan Whitmore was not a man who believed in fate. He was a creature of logic, rooted in the tangible and the explainable. As an accountant in a quiet English town, his days were dictated by numbers, invoices, and ledgers, all of which followed rules, fixed, predictable, comforting. He liked it that way. So, when the letter arrived on his doorstep one cold October morning, it was met with irritation rather than concern. It was an unmarked envelope, aged yellow with no return address. At first, he thought it was another piece of junk mail, perhaps a scam or some cryptic advertisement. But the weight of the paper was wrong, thicker than normal. Curious, he tore it open and unfolded the single sheet inside. The ink was faded, almost smudged, as if it had been written long ago. The words were brief, but chilling. "You will die in 7 days." Ethan scoffed. A prank, surely. Some juvenile attempt at spooking a stranger. He considered throwing it away, but something about the letter unsettled him. The paper felt brittle under his fingertips, its scent strangely musty, as though it had been sealed away for decades. Shaking his head, he tossed it onto the kitchen counter and tried to push it from his mind. But as the day wore on, a subtle unease clung to him like a shadow. He found himself glancing at the letter more than once, his eyes drawn to the eerie certainty in its message. That night, as he lay in bed, the silence of his apartment pressed in. The words echoed in his head. 7 days. It was ridiculous, absurd, and yet Ethan Whitmore did not sleep well. The morning after receiving the letter, Ethan Whitmore told himself it was nothing, just a sick joke, a random prank. He was a rational man. He refused to let his mind entertain such nonsense. But something had changed overnight. As he entered the kitchen for his morning coffee, his gaze flickered to the counter where he had left the letter. His breath caught. The letter was different. The handwriting, the faded ink, the misty paper. It was all the same. But now, beneath the first chilling sentence, new words had appeared. "You will die in 6 days. A bird will strike your window today. A bad omen of what's to come." Ethan's stomach twisted. He was certain, absolutely certain, that these words had not been there yesterday. His hands hovered over the letter, as if touching it might make the words vanish. He considered the possibility that someone had broken into his apartment, replaced the letter with an altered version, but the doors were locked, the windows were closed. Nothing was out of place. A joke, he reminded himself. A prank, a coincidence. But even as he tried to rationalize, the weight of the words settled heavily in his chest. Hours passed, and Ethan did his best to go about his day as usual. He showered, got dressed, and headed to work at the accounting firm. He refused to let the letter take hold of his mind. Yet, throughout the morning, a gnawing sense of dread clung to him, like the memory of a nightmare that refused to fade. Then, just before noon, the first prediction came true. A sharp, violent thud echoed through his apartment. Ethan flinched, nearly dropping his coffee. His pulse hammered as he turned toward the window. A small bird, a sparrow, lay motionless on the ledge outside, its tiny body crumpled, lifeless. A single crack ran through the glass where it had struck. A chill crept down his spine. Coincidence? It had to be. And yet, his hands trembled as he reached for the letter again. Day 2. The second morning, Ethan awoke drenched in sweat. He had spent the previous night tossing and turning, his mind replaying the sound of the bird hitting the glass. But as soon as he got out of bed, he saw it. The letter was different again. The text had grown longer. Below the first two sentences, new words had appeared overnight, written in the same faded ink. You will die in 5 days. Today you will hear your name spoken by someone who isn't there. Ethan's breath hitched. His head swam with disbelief. He read the words again and again, but they remained unchanged. The ink was no longer fresh, no sign that someone had altered it in the night. He was losing his mind. He had to be. He tried to ignore it, to force himself into the normalcy of routine. But paranoia gnawed at him. Every sound made him flinch. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, they all seemed too loud, as if the walls themselves were listening. The day dragged on, his nerves fraying with every passing hour, but nothing happened. No voices, no strange whispers. Maybe the letter was wrong. Relief began to creep in, until evening fell. He was brushing his teeth, his mind momentarily blank, when it happened. A whisper, software, faint, but unmistakable. Ethan. He spun around so fast, his heart nearly stopped. His apartment was empty. He was alone. The walls stood still, silent, unbroken. His breath came in short gasps. He staggered backward, gripping the edge of the sink. Number. No. It was in his head. A trick of exhaustion. That's all. He stumbled into bed, shoving the letter into a drawer. He didn't want to see it. He didn't want to read whatever new horror awaited him in the morning. But he knew. He knew. The words would be different when he woke up. Day 3. Ethan didn't want to look at the letter, but he had no choice. As soon as he opened the drawer, his stomach lurched. The text had grown again. You will die in 4 days. Today you will lose something important to you. His fingers clenched the brittle paper. His mind raced. What would he lose? His wallet? His keys? Something sentimental? The day passed in a haze of paranoia. He double-checked his pockets. He avoided taking anything outside. He stayed locked in his apartment, but it didn't matter. That evening, he received a phone call. It was his mother. Her voice was tight, trembling. His father was dead. A heart attack. Sudden. Unexpected. Ethan's body went numb. The letter had been right again. But this was different. This was real. This was personal. Something important had been taken from him. His father. The walls of his apartment felt like they were closing in. The air was thick, suffocating. Ethan grabbed the letter and tore it apart, shredding it into 1,000 pieces. He threw them into the garbage, his chest heaving with panic. It was over. It had to be over. But deep down, he knew. It wasn't over at all. Day 4. The next morning, Ethan barely slept. The apartment felt heavier, the silence more oppressive. He hesitated before checking the garbage can. His breath caught. The letter was whole again, untouched, as if it had never been torn apart. And the words had changed once more. You will die in 3 days. Today, you will see someone who should not be there. Terror gripped him. He considered leaving town, running as far as he could. But no matter where he went, the letter would find him. He knew that now. So, he waited. Evening came. He sat in his dimly lit living room, every muscle in his body tense. And then, in the reflection of the television screen, he saw it. A figure, standing behind him. A shadowy outline, motionless, watching. His stomach dropped. Cold sweat drenched his skin. He turned, heart pounding. But there was no one there. Yet the presence lingered. A whisper of breath at his neck. A flicker of movement in the corners of his vision. He was not alone. Not anymore. Day 5. Ethan didn't leave his bed the next morning. The letter sat on his bedside table, waiting. He didn't want to read it, but he had no choice. You will die in 2 days. Today you will hear knocking at your door. but no one will be there. He waited. Hours passed in a suffocating stillness. Then, knock, knock, knock. The sound sent ice through his veins. He held his breath, frozen in place. Another knock. Slow, measured. He crept toward the door, his hands trembling. He placed his eye to the peephole. Nothing. But the knocking continued. Ethan did not open the door. Day 6. The letter had only one new line. Tomorrow you will be gone. Ethan was no longer afraid. Fear had given way to cold, hollow acceptance. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. He simply existed, waiting for the inevitable. Night came. A deep, unnatural darkness settled over his apartment. The clocks stopped ticking. The air became still. Then, the whisper. It's time. The lights flickered. The shadows moved. And Ethan Whitmore was never seen again. The final day. His apartment was empty. His possessions untouched. No one remembered when they had last seen him. His name faded from records, his existence unraveling like an old threadbare cloth. There was no letter, no trace of him at all. As if he had never been, Ethan Whitmore was gone. Not just dead, gone. His apartment stood eerily undisturbed, as if no one had ever lived there. Dust gathered on the furniture. The fridge remained stocked with untouched food, and his bed lay perfectly made. Yet something felt wrong, something no one could quite put into words. His neighbors had vague recollections of a man who lived in the unit, but his name escaped them. The landlord checked his records only to find an empty lease. His co-workers noticed an unoccupied desk at the firm, but no one could remember hiring or firing anyone by that name. His mother, still reeling from her husband's sudden death, had a gnawing feeling in her chest, a feeling that someone else was missing. She sat on the couch for hours, staring at old photo albums, flipping through the pages, searching. The spaces in the photos felt larger than they should have been. A figure should have been standing beside her. A presence should have existed. But the more she tried to recall, the more it slipped away, like a dream unraveling at dawn. And then, one day, she stopped searching, just like everyone else. The apartment remained untouched. Potential renters came and went, but none stayed for long. There was always something off about the place, an unshakable emptiness, a silence too deep, a coldness that lingered in the walls. Some swore they felt a presence, as if someone unseen was still there, waiting. A few claimed to hear something at night, a whisper carried through the vents, the softest murmur of a name. Ethan. But Ethan Whitmore did not exist. Not in memories, not in documents, not in reality. And yet, the letter remained, a new beginning. The apartment sat vacant for a year before someone else moved in. A woman named Claire Delaney, a young teacher eager for a fresh start. She found the place cozy, albeit unusually quiet. The previous tenant had left no belongings behind. No furniture, no clothes, nothing, except for one thing, a single yellowed envelope. Claire found it tucked inside a kitchen drawer on her first night. The paper was rough, the ink smudged, the handwriting unfamiliar. Curious, she opened it. You will die in 7 days. Her breath hitched. A joke? Some forgotten relic from the last tenant? She frowned and set it aside, deciding to think nothing of it. But deep in the apartment's unseen corners, something stirred. Something patient. Something waiting. Ethan Whitmore had vanished, but the letter remained.